The ancient Olympic Games. The dust rose in a low, choking cloud over Olympia in the summer heat. It clung to the runners' legs, turned their sweat to mud, and blurred the line between flesh and earth. A single trumpet note cut through the air. Men leaned forward at the starting groove, toes pressed against stone, backs taut as bowstrings. Somewhere in the crowd, a father shouted a name that would be forgotten by nightfall. Somewhere else, a judge lifted a rod, ready to strike any man who broke too soon. And in that suspended moment, before the first foot struck the ground, before victory and humiliation tore men apart, there was only silence, and the knowledge that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. What, exactly, were they running toward, and what were they leaving behind? The textbooks say the ancient Olympic Games were a noble celebration of sport, a peaceful gathering where Greeks set aside their wars to honor the gods. That version is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Beneath the marble ideal lay a world of rivalry, politics, and brutal personal cost. What follows will reveal three things that change how this spectacle is understood: that the games were as much about power as piety, that victory could elevate a man beyond kings yet destroy him just as quickly, and that the peace they symbolized was more fragile, and more strategic, than it appeared. At its heart lies a question that has never been fully settled: were the ancient Olympics a sacred escape from violence, or simply another arena where Greek ambition found its most disciplined form? Long before the first recorded games in 776 BCE, the Greek world was not a nation but a fractured mosaic of city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, each stood as its own universe, bound by language and gods but divided by pride. War was not an exception, it was a rhythm of life. In this world, honor was everything. A man's worth was measured not by wealth alone, but by how others spoke his name. Glory was currency, and it could be earned in only a few ways: on the battlefield, in politics, or in rare moments of public triumph that lifted a man above his peers. Olympia, a sanctuary in the western Peloponnese, became the unlikely stage for such triumphs. It was not a city but a sacred space, dedicated to Zeus. Every 4 years, athletes, poets, and spectators traveled dangerous roads to gather there. For a brief time, a truce, the Ekakeria, was declared. Wars paused, at least in theory, so men could compete without fear of ambush. But even this peace carried tension. Armies did not vanish, they waited. Rivalries did not dissolve, they sharpened. Ordinary life for these men was harsh. Training meant relentless physical discipline, often under the guidance of trainers who pushed bodies to their limits. Diets were strict, routines unforgiving. There were no second chances, no silver medals. Victory meant everything. Defeat meant obscurity. And here lies a surprising truth: the earliest Olympic Games featured only one event, the Stadion race, a sprint of roughly 192 meters. No grand festival of dozens of sports, no sprawling spectacle. Just a single test of speed, repeated every 4 years. The vast complexity people imagine came later, built slowly over centuries. Into this world stepped the athletes themselves, men from varied backgrounds, though almost always citizens of status, shaped by their city's expectations. Some were sons of farmers, others of aristocrats, but all carried the weight of representation. They did not compete as individuals alone, they ran, wrestled, and fought for the honor of their polis. And yet, beneath that collective pride, another truth emerged: they were also chasing something deeply personal, a kind of immortality that only victory could grant. The games were not merely about winning. They were about being remembered. The first test came long before Olympia. It began in the quiet, repetitive grind of training. A young athlete would rise before dawn, his muscles still aching from the day before, and submit himself again to the same punishing drills. There was no guarantee of success, only the distant possibility of glory. Some broke under the strain. Others endured. And a few, rare and relentless, began to separate themselves. One such figure, Milo of Croton, became a legend not only for his victories but for the discipline that forged them. It was said he trained by carrying a calf on his shoulders every day, growing stronger as the animal grew heavier. Whether literal or symbolic, the story captured something essential: greatness here was not given. It was built, slowly, painfully, over years. But strength alone was not enough. The games demanded strategy, composure, and an almost theatrical awareness of the crowd. Rivalries emerged quickly. City against city. Athlete against athlete. A Spartan runner might face an Athenian, each carrying centuries of tension onto the track. The contest became more than physical, it became political theater. And then came the turning point for many, the moment of arrival at Olympia. After days or weeks of travel, the athlete entered the sacred grounds, surrounded by statues of past victors. Names carved in stone. Stories whispered in awe. Here, the scale of what was at stake became undeniable. Before competing, athletes swore an oath to Zeus, promising fairness and discipline. Yet even here, the ideal clashed with reality. Cheating occurred. Bribes were whispered about. Victors were not always the most virtuous, only the most successful. What did it mean, then, to win? When the contest began, time seemed to narrow. In the Stadion race, it was over in seconds. In wrestling or pancration, a brutal blend of boxing and grappling, it could stretch into a test of endurance and pain. There were few rules. Broken fingers, shattered noses, even death were not unknown. One observer would later describe the pancration as a contest where everything was permitted except biting and gouging. Even that boundary, at times, blurred. Victory, when it came, transformed everything. The winner received not gold, but a simple olive wreath. Yet its value was immeasurable. He returned home to triumphal processions, free meals for life, and sometimes even political power. Poets composed odes in his honor. His name traveled far beyond his city. But at what cost? At the peak of their glory, these athletes stood as symbols of human excellence. The games expanded over time, new events added, crowds grew, prestige intensified. Olympia became a center not just of sport, but of Greek identity itself. For a moment, it seemed the games fulfilled their highest promise, a shared cultural heartbeat in a divided world. Yet beneath this unity, cracks widened. Wealth began to influence outcomes. Professionalism crept in. Athletes trained full-time, sponsored by their cities or patrons. The line between noble competition and calculated ambition blurred. Some winners became obsessed with maintaining their status. Others fell into excess, unable to reconcile the quiet of ordinary life with the roar of the crowd they had once commanded. The personal cost could be immense. Years of training left bodies broken. The adoration of victory faded quickly, replaced by the expectation to win again. And then, inevitably, came the moment when the body could no longer answer the call. For some, this was the beginning of the end, not just of their careers, but of their identity. Who were they without victory? Without the wreath, the crowd, the songs? The games themselves also faced pressures. Political tension seeped into the sacred space. City-states used victories as propaganda. Even the sacred truce was occasionally violated, revealing its fragility. Was this still a celebration of the gods, or something else entirely? In the end, the story of the ancient Olympic Games was not one of a single fall, but of gradual transformation. The ideals remained, but the reality shifted. An athlete stood one final time on the sands of Olympia, no longer the favorite, no longer certain. The crowd watched with the same hunger, the same expectation. But this time, the outcome was different. Defeat came not with drama, but with silence. No procession. No ode. Just the quiet departure of a man who had once been everything. Was this inevitable? Perhaps. The games elevated men to heights that could not be sustained. The same system that created legends also consumed them. And yet, the central question lingered: were these men victims of a flawed system, or willing participants in a pursuit that demanded everything? The legacy of the ancient Olympic Games stretched far beyond Olympia. They shaped the Greek understanding of excellence, arete, a concept that fused physical ability with moral and intellectual virtue. Without the Games, Greek culture might have lacked one of its most powerful unifying traditions. The shared calendar, the shared stories, the shared heroes, all radiated outward from this sacred competition. Their influence touched art, literature, and politics. Victors inspired sculptures that defined ideals of the human form. Poets like Pindar immortalized their achievements, preserving names that would otherwise have vanished. And yet, history's judgment was uneven. The Games were often remembered as purer than they truly were, their flaws softened by time. At the same moment, the brutal realities, the injuries, the corruption, the personal sacrifices, were quietly set aside. The truth lay somewhere in between. The ancient Olympics were neither a perfect sanctuary nor a mere extension of conflict. They were something more complex, a stage where human ambition, discipline, and desire collided under the gaze of the divine. And in that collision, something extraordinary emerged, something that still echoed long after the last race ended. They were not just games. They were a mirror of a civilization at its most intense. So the question remains: were the ancient Olympic Games a sacred ideal worth preserving, or a flawed pursuit that revealed the cost of greatness? And if a single moment of victory could define a lifetime, was it ever truly worth the price?